Hello students. As you can see, this is beautiful countryside. It is more than beautiful, it is glorious. And we have to discuss subjects that are not so beautiful, but that make this kind of beauty possible. So, let's get on with our work. We have reached Module 5, and this is Lesson 1, Consequences of Depop. There is hardly an aspect of our lives that is not affected in one way or another by the global depopulation policy and by its necessities. And there is hardly a person on this planet who is not touched both directly and indirectly by the many measures of depopulation. The only people who can claim to be outside the reach of the global depopulation policy are the isolated tribes of the Amazon and other such scattered groups living in remote and inaccessible parts of the globe, far, far away from civilization. The following is but a sketch of the direct, indirect, and unintended consequences of the global depopulation program. Let's start with the direct consequences. Any attempt at social engineering, especially at this global scale, will have a cascading effect. Some effects will be expected and others unexpected. Politically, the fallout of the global depopulation policy has irrevocably altered the nature of our societies by stripping away the fundamental supports of freedom and democracy. Illegitimate governments and false democracies is one of the direct consequences of the global depopulation policy. A policy that can only be implemented in secret and against the will of the people will by necessity require bypassing the democratic process, as voters would never give their consent to governments to poison them into infertility and chronic and debilitating illness. Governments have decided to never ask for permission. But governments exist to ensure the security of the people, not to subvert it. The global depopulation policy has turned the role of government upside down and inside out, and has therefore annihilated the social contract that exists between the electorate and the elected, rendering every Western government, and indeed every government throughout the world that has perversely claimed to be democratic, the very opposite. This means that since 1945, the world has not known democracy, but only its illusion, and a perverted one at that. A second consequence, political consequence, is the abnegation of the rule of law and structural violence. How do you commit genocide and crimes against humanity and still preserve the rule of law? The answer is obvious. It is not possible. Legality is the basis of legitimacy, and the depopulation policy is grossly outside the law, rendering the administration of justice illegal and the authority of the state ill-gained. Only by manipulating the legal system to be blind to the atrocities committed by the depopulation policy can the state preserve its authority, but in so doing destroy its integrity. Structural violence, defined as violence committed by social institutions, has become enshrined at the core of nations as the primary function of the state. For that is the only way to sufficiently harm people so as to lower their numbers and stop them from breeding while pretending to serve them. The judiciary and legislative branches of government have been enlisted by the executive branch to be active participants in the structural violence made necessary by the depopulation effort. And their participation has resulted not only in their refusal to identify and punish those responsible for committing crimes against humanity, but also their complicity in passing and enforcing laws designed to destroy the lives of families, designed to destroy life, and especially designed to destroy the lives and the families of those at the bottom rung of society, who already bear the brunt of economic and political decisions made to deny them a place in society. The greater imperative of the global depopulation policy has consequently erased the separation between the three branches of government, without which neither democracy nor the rule of law can exist. A third political fallout is the misuse of institutions and taxes. Since the goals of the depopulation policy are antithetical to those of any functioning human society, the institutions of state must be manipulated from the top to achieve the very opposite of what they were created to do. This explains why nothing works as it should anymore in our countries and in our societies. The fruits of our labor, our taxes, are being used against us by funding institutions and programs that harm, not help us. Ministries of health promote poisons in our food and water and publish false research to justify their actions. Ministries of justice pass laws designed to get the weak, the poor and the foreign behind bars to ensure that their families do not flourish. Ministries of labor are given directives to keep the unemployed out of work, the underemployed desperately poor, and the employed overworked, for that is how the populace is kept docile and afraid. The ministries of information wage campaigns of indoctrination and misinformation and fill our airwaves and newspapers with inconsequential news while avoiding the matters that truly affect us. Ministries of finance are delegated to deepen and widen both personal and public debt, and to funnel the wealth created by our labor into the pockets of a select few who delegate the depopulation policy from the top and who need this money to make it work against us. That is why we are getting sicker, poorer, dumber and weaker and more desperate with every passing decade, while our fertility rates continue to decrease nicely and our family trees are losing their branches. A fourth political consequence is surveillance, censorship and control. The further along the depopulation policy proceeds, the more ambitious its objectives are and the greater the need for repressive measures to ensure success. But repression in supposedly democratic states whose existence depends on maintaining the illusion of democracy and the rule of law must take forms that can be justified by higher prerogatives and must be sufficiently subtle and gradual to avoid backlash. Hence, our surveillance society is explained as necessary to ensure our security from terrorist attacks. Terrorists that are the creation of our own security networks, our own security services, and whose existence in our midst is kept alive by false flag events orchestrated by the collaborative efforts of the depopulation lobby and their mercenaries. Hence, our censored media and social networking sites, as well as the classification of millions upon millions of government documents formerly in the public domain, is explained as necessary lest the terrorists take advantage of our open society and plan and carry out new attacks on us. Hence, increasingly intrusive methods of control, such as ID checks, body scans, involuntary detentions, denials of due process, military tribunals, the imprisonment of whistleblowers, the detention of immigrants, lifelong imprisonments for stealing a steak, etc., have completely annihilated our fundamental rights and civil liberties by making them conditional on national security, public morals, and the integrity of our borders. In other words, on the interests and goals of the depopulation lobby. The second set of direct consequences are ethical in nature. What constitutes right and wrong is for every society to decide for itself, and not for governments and elites to decide on their own. It is the indefensibility of the goals and methods of the global depopulation policy that have forced our leaders to circumvent not only our democratic processes and the rule of law, but also the very norms and principles on which our morality rests. The first victim, ethical victim, of the depopulation program is our culture, which has become a culture of deception, dishonesty, and cruelty. Whether they like it or not, governments have to lie to their people and to deceive them into believing a false reality, an illusion, a manufacture to hide the dangerous truths of the depopulation policy. Lies are built upon lies. We are told that fluoride is good for our teeth, that chemtrails are meant to slow down global warming, that GMOs will increase yields and feed the starving, that plastic is safe and clean, that flu vaccines will save the sick and the old from dying, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that the government intercepts only the conversations and emails of terrorists, that 9/11 was the work of Islamic fundamentalists, that affluence stops overpopulation, that the government is looking after your best interests, that the media is free, and so on. Lies and more lies to cover up the cruelties of a eugenic and genocidal policy that makes our children sick, makes us sterile, makes our society a farce, degrades our species, and dishonors us in the eyes of God and history. A second ethical consequence is a warped media. Instead of educating and informing the public, the media's role is to misinform and to indoctrinate in the global depopulation era. Deception and dissimulation have proliferated alongside the increasing monopolization of the media by a few giant corporations that now have a stranglehold on the truth and are purely in the business of disseminating propaganda, now euphemistically called public relations. The highest priority of the mainstream media, be it corporate-controlled or government-controlled, is to manufacture consent, and staying on message requires central control, which is why the same news are regurgitated by an army of journalists and hundreds of channels that draw their news from a dozen press agencies, harnessed to the same global power center and power structure. But the bewildered herd is beginning to see through the smokescreen of the mass media and are turning for news to the internet, which is why the New World Order and the depopulationists who control it are in a state of panic and have launched a full-scale attack on internet freedom by interfering with the free flow of information on the World Wide Web. They're doing this by shutting down independent websites that expose aspects of the depopulation policy and by erecting in their stead dummy websites that disseminate half-truths so as to discredit those who reveal aspects of the depopulation policy as conspiracy theorists and crackpots. These purveyors of falsities that then incorporate kernels of truth within outlandish conspiracy theories that blame everything under the sun on defunct or irrelevant groups such as the Illuminati or the Freemasons, or on alien invasions and royal bloodlines. The websites that cannot be shut down because they're too important or too well established are being monitored by shills who hone in on anyone who disseminates sensitive information with attacks ad hominem designed to discourage, intimidate, and discredit. The third ethical consequence is that of targeting the poor, the weak, and the foreign. The low socioeconomic section of society is the primary target of depopulation. The ranks of the poor are under the concerted attack of the structural violence orchestrated for depopulation purposes on all fronts, be it chemical, biological, psychosocial, or economic. That is why the poor alone are subject to the full panoply of depopulation methods, and consequently suffer from disproportionate rates of death, dysfunction, disability, incarceration, and infertility. The dramatic inequality artificially created by the depopulation lobby has resulted in a society of haves and have-nots, of the 1% elite that is buttressed by the struggling middle class that makes up 10 to 30% depending on the country, while the rest of us, the remaining 70 to 90%, are the poor, best defined as those who are a few paychecks away from homelessness. This economic division of society reflects the division of society necessitated by the global depopulation policy, with 1% insiders, those in the know who delegate things from the top, followed by the 10% to 30% who are on a need-to-know basis since they keep the system running, and the rest, who comprise the vast majority, are the completely clueless outsiders who, when told that they have been scheduled for annihilation, will smile smugly and call you mad. Money and knowledge are the shields necessary to survive the demographic transition. Money enables one to stay away from the bad foods, bad water, and bad circumstances, while knowledge allows one to know what is safe and what isn't, and therefore know how to protect oneself and one's offspring. The third set of direct circumstances are medical. Access to money and knowledge ensures security from the multiple weapons directed at the populace by those in control of policy. I cannot give my readers the money necessary to protect themselves and their children, but I am giving them the knowledge necessary to do so. The first and foremost consequence, a medical consequence of the depopulation policy, is irreversible infertility. Different body types react in different ways to chronic poisoning. Those who are least resistant and who are exposed the longest, that is to say throughout their lives, or worse, over multiple generations, or at the most crucial time in their development, that is to say in the womb or during the first 5 years of life, will suffer the most dire repercussions and will be rendered infertile or subfertile. Some 20% of people exposed to the depopulation policy's chemical and biological agents are already infertile, and some 60% subfertile, and that is across the populations of the developed world. This leaves only about 20% with normal fertility, of whom the vast majority have escaped chronic poisoning because they live in the country. The second consequence is general ill health. Since all fertility-depressing agents used are endocrine disruptors, the damage done to the human organism is universal. Every citizen of the developed world is affected in one way or another, and a good 60% suffer in various degrees from illness. There is no point even listing all of the diseases caused or exacerbated by the depopulation program, because all chronic or non-communicable diseases are the result of depop. As I have demonstrated in my work, the epidemiologic transition, thus the transition from infectious diseases to chronic illnesses, has been caused by the demographic transition. In other words, by the depopulation program and its poisons. A third medical consequence is downgraded genetic and intellectual endowments, and this is perhaps the gravest. Multi-generational exposure to poisons that cause neurological and physiological deterioration results in cumulative damage to our species' genetic and intellectual endowment. That is to say, damage that is worse from generation to generation. After 3, and in some cases 4 generations have been subjected to chronic poisoning, the damage is so extensive and so severe as to render a good 10% of the population completely dysfunctional, and the remaining 90% inferior both physically and intellectually to previous generations. We are, as a result, a feebler race. The 4th medical consequence is endemic mental and developmental illnesses. Children bear the brunt of the mass poisoning and consequently incur serious damage to the brain, which is exhibited through mental and developmental illnesses that together affect 1/4 of our children and youth, which is a 5-fold increase in only half a century. If this continues, all of our children will be completely destroyed long before the end of this century. A 5th consequence is sexual confusion. Prenatal exposure to fluoride and BPA, for instance, disrupts the interaction of fetal hormones on the developing brain that play a role in sex differentiation, which in turn influences the sexual orientation that emerges later in life, in adulthood. The result is a 3-time higher incidence of individuals with aberrant sexual preferences than would be naturally occurring.